Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and Southern Command, joins me. Good morning, Admiral. How are you? Up, you're in our mute button. Somebody left a. You're there. Okay. So, Admiral, I think we fixed it on our end. Last night, I walked a Marine officer and Hugh Hewitt walked into a bar to have dinner. And unfortunately, they're different bars because we did not communicate together. And so the Marine Corps officer and a professional communicator ended up miles apart. And so we're going to try again on Tuesday. The reason we're getting together, and this is a long setup, by the way. How are you?
Couldn't be better. Doing lovely. Headed to New York City.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But let me read to you what we were going to talk about. He had heard Seth Crosby write about navalist matters, and he said that Mr. Cropsey opens his article by asserting that the balance of forces in the Pacific does not favor the Chinese in a conflict. He continues to say that we could lose our qualitative edge over time, but I do not believe we have it now. That's the Marine Corps officer. The navalist perspective is that the qualitative military edge for our maritime platforms outweighs the numerical strength of the PLAN, but that only goes so far in a truly joint fight when determining the CCP's military objective. It does not account for how a conflict will likely start in Southeast Asia, and it does not count for the lack of our interoperability with our allies. What do you think, Admiral?
I think there's a lot of truth in the second statement, what you called the navalist one. I think that, yes, China has more warships, as you and I have discussed, over 350. We have less than 300. But quality matters in a fight. And if you ask me, I'll give you a real metric, real world metric. You ask me, okay, Admiral, which hand of cards would you rather play in this particular fight? I would reach for the U.S. for exactly the reasons outlined. I think a second point that's kind of threaded through your commentary is our joint warfighting ability. And yes, it will be a joint fight. We're pretty good at that at this point, at knitting together air, sea, land, special forces, cyber, space. I think I'd give us a significant advantage there. And then third, you mentioned allies. There it's some pluses and some minuses. The pluses, obviously, the Japanese bring very capable warships, Aegis, surface combatants, superb diesel submarines. The Koreans are not bad. The Aussies are not bad. That can help ease that quantitative point. But on the other hand, as you said, and I'll close with this, the interoperability there. We have not trained the way we have in NATO. We've got work to do there. The Koreans and Japanese still don't even like to train or exercise together. Work to do there on the interoperability with the allies piece. But overall, bottom line, I think the U.S. still enjoys a slight edge overall.
My friendly neighbor, Marine Corps friend, went on to explain to me there's a difference between integrated, which I always say we're integrated with our allies, and interoperable, which I didn't get because I'm a civilian dummy. And would you explain that to the audience? Because I found out that's a very key difference between saying we're integrated with our allies and interoperable with our allies.
Yeah, it's actually a kind of a technical difference, but it's an important one. Integrated means the will, the intent. We've exchanged liaison officers. We've done a fairly reasonable level of looking at each other's doctrine. We've operated together somewhat. Interoperable is a whole higher level. That means our radios are talking to each other. Our data link systems are talking to each other. Our space communications is linked up both in high space and all the way down to the surface of the ocean and down below it. It means that our logistics chains are together. We have interoperability, exceptionally good interoperability in NATO with our NATO allies because we spend enormous amount of time. Here's the real point: looking at the metrics, looking at the facts. You are integrated almost immediately politically. You go out and operate. You have the same objectives. Interoperable is the work of a decade.
All right, now let me turn to the other subject we were going to talk about last night when we were not together, and we will talk about tomorrow night when we are, which is why we support Ukraine. There are a lot of reasons to support Ukraine. He made me aware that Ukraine produces 30% of the world's wheat. And that if Russia gets control of that wheat, it gives them another asset that compensates for their declining military prowess. I hadn't really thought about wheat blackmail before, but it's true. Has that ever come up when you were NATO Allied Supreme Commander about how much the world depends upon Ukrainian wheat?
Yes, absolutely. And it lies alongside. As usual, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is the other major producers of wheat are the United States of America, Canada, Brazil produces a lot of wheat alongside a lot of rice and a lot of corn. It's a huge breadbasket. There are some, if you will, Western nations that produce a hell of a lot of grain. It's really not just wheat, it's really all these grains. The bad news is, this is why Putin is so obsessed with Ukraine from an economic perspective. The other huge wheat producer, of course, is Russia. So if Putin were to get control of Ukraine, he would have control of over almost 50% of the world's supply of wheat. And that is extremely significant. And final thought, we know he is critically aware of this, Hugh, because how is he using the Black Sea Fleet today? He's using it to strangle the Ukrainian ability to export that wheat. In effect, Putin has already shut down a significant chunk, and that really is food blackmail. It's using food as a weapon, and this is something that Putin very consciously is doing in this conflict. And yes, it's an important part of the reason Putin wants Ukraine.
So this trampolines me over to Slovakia, and I've never been there. I'm sure you have been repeatedly. They have elected a new government. Looks like a pro-Russian premier will be coming in. What does that mean to you, Admiral?
It worries me, and it is yet another indication of the support for Ukraine just starting to crack at different ends of the spectrum. And we'll come on a moment to how it's looking in the United States. But what you're discussing in the capital city of Slovakia, Bratislava, which I have visited many times, has elected a man named Robert Fico, F-I-C-O, and he is, I think it's fair to say, he's pro-Putin, pro-Russian, anti-the West, anti-Ukrainian. It's gonna create a real challenge for NATO and for the European Union, because he will lead that government in a direction that's very out of step with the rest of Europe on Ukraine. The only other similar kind of government, not as bad, is over in Hungary, another important country in that region. And there you see a long-term figure who's been in power, who's kind of not quite as far to the Russian side of things as Fico is in Slovakia. So it's quite worrisome. Again, let's keep it in perspective, as we should here in the United States as well. Of the 28 EU, European Union nations, of the now 32 nations in NATO, 90% of them will continue to be fully supportive of Ukraine. And finish with this, Hugh. Here in the United States, we just saw a vote which took out the Ukrainian aid. But if you really look at the numbers there, I think you will find a pretty strong center that's going to hold, certainly in the Senate. I think also over in the House of Representatives.
I agree with that. I think that's a given. But I want to go back to Slovakia for a second, because it ties back to my interoperability and integrated. Does NATO have to cut off, if the guy's a Putin puppet, and he is, Fico sounds like he's just a Putin cat paw. Does NATO have a way to stop him from telling Putin what we're doing?
Not in a immediate sort of throw the switch kind of way. And you know, we have gone through this, frankly, with Turkey, which is not anywhere remotely pro-Putin, pro-Russia per se, but certainly with the purchase of the S-400 air defense system from Russia by Erdogan of Turkey, NATO was faced with these kind of choices. And what we did was we sort of throttled the information flow going to those air defense systems so that they were unable to be interoperable. The S-400 is not interoperable. It's not linked into the NATO system. I could see a scenario with Slovakia, which, let's face it, is a much, much less capable nation militarily. I'd put them at the very bottom of NATO militaries in terms of what they bring to the fight. But I think you're going to see the intelligence get throttled down significantly. And I think your point, that conversation is happening right now in Brussels and Mons, where the Supreme Allied Commander headquarters is located.
You know, and that's my last question, Admiral. If you were still head of NATO, what do you do right now when all of a sudden the government flips from being your ally to being the ally of Putin? I mean, what do you actually order up done? You can't like put them in a different room.
The first thing you do is you meet with the senior military and you get a sense of where are their heads in this whole thing. And so what the Supreme Allied Commander is doing, I would guess, General Chris Cavoli, I know him well, he's very smart, very integrated with his counterparts. He's picking up the phone and calling the Chief of Defense, the CHOD, we would say, in Bratislava, Slovakia this morning. And just, he's in listen mode. He, the Supreme Allied Commander. How does this look? What's going to happen? Are you going to change your alert levels? What's going to happen to your defense procurement? Are you going to pull everything back from supporting Ukraine? So at the military to military level, there's a whole additional channel that is very, very important. And it's one that General Cavoli, I'm sure, is exploring this morning.
Admiral James Stavridis, follow him on the site formerly known as Twitter, now known as X, at Stavridis J. And have a good trip to New York today, Admiral. Always good to see you again. Thank you for joining me.